History is full of amazing stories and memorable people.
But we don't care about them.
No hits, deep tracks only.
Some of the most influential people in the world have been completely overlooked or just plain forgotten.
We're digging deep into the history books to bring you their stories.
And maybe some laughs along the way.
This is History's B-Side. Today's B-Sider is Crazy Nancy.
I want to thank everyone who's here at Sundog Cellars and tuning in on Facebook for our first ever live podcast, our first ever live episode of History's B-Side. If you are hearing us for the first time ever, we do a history podcast where we kind of talk about history's lesser known or unforgotten people. It's a lot of the stories that you've probably heard before, explained a lot more simply, and then the people from those stories that you probably haven't heard of that kind of made the stories happen.
Yeah. We kind of got into this to educate ourselves on history first because we felt like we didn't know a ton and wanted to give some of the more forgotten people a voice. And you can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. You can find us on iHeartRadio and Anchor as well. And we're also on Facebook, Instagram. Are we on Twitter?
We are on Twitter.
We're on Twitter. At History's B-Side. And you can also reach us at historiesbside@gmail.com if you want to comment, ask questions, suggest any topics for us. We're always happy to hear from fans and listeners.
So we want to thank, first of all, Nicole and the staff here at Sundog Cellars. We have our drinks here. It's a local cider house and winery in Columbiana, Ohio, celebrating their grand opening of their new location. Got a big Kentucky Derby party going on throughout here today. So we're happy to be a part of this and to record our first ever live podcast episode. Nicole asked us before we started to do a topic on women in Prohibition. So we had to do a little bit of research, and we've dug up some really interesting people that were involved in Prohibition that probably haven't heard of before. So we're going to talk a little bit about the history of Prohibition and, of course, the women behind it. What are you drinking today, Matt?
Right now I'm drinking the Grab a Cab Cabernet Sauvignon.
What is that?
Well, I assume it's a Cabernet Sauvignon. It's a red wine. It's, I would say dry. Good tannin structure.
I have a watermelon strawberry cider, which is not normally my jam, but I felt that it was appropriate for today's topic.
Is that a pun?
Yeah. I don't know. I'm not really like a cider drinker normally, but today's episode is going to have a lot to do with cider and production of alcoholic spirits at that time, so I thought it was appropriate to get a cider and imbibe. Are you familiar with the term teetotaler?
I am, now that we've researched for this, but...
So a teetotaler, and that's going to kind of come into the idea of prohibition, but a teetotaler is a person who really abstains from the consumption of alcohol in total. Someone who does not drink at all. Clearly, you and I are not teetotalers, otherwise we wouldn't be doing this.
We are not I don't think we can call ourselves teetotalers, Phil, no.
But it's definitely going to play a role in Prohibition.
Yeah. So usually our episodes are laid out so that we cover, the basics and kind of a foundation of a period of history or an event in history, and then go into our topic for the second half of the episode. So just to kind of back up a little bit and give everybody a good foundation of the history of Prohibition and alcohol in the United States. Alcoholic beverages were part of American history and culture from pretty much the beginning. The earliest settlers carried barrels of beer with them over from Europe. Rum was served to soldiers in the Continental Army by Washington when he could get his hands on some. Apparently they had some shortages, but...
Were the liquors that were served then pretty similar to what we know today? I assume the production wasn't quite as strict or regimented, but would the taste of rum in the 1700s be similar to what we drink today?
I don't know that it would be vastly different, but I imagine so just because of those production changes. They're also, I don't know if this is true of rum, but in wine and beer, sometimes they would add spices to them. We don't usually do that today, but the same way you would with like an apple cider, like adding cinnamon or nutmeg to the mixture, sometimes honey to make it sweeter.
I mean, we definitely do that with everything now. Like, go to a craft beer bar now and try to order something that isn't flavored one way or another.
Right. So, from the beginning, drinking accompanied most social events and gatherings in the United States. When people when people, celebrated a business deal, when they bought a new house, when they won a battle, when they lost a battle, they would drink. So it was a really kind of intertwined social and cultural symbol. And a lot of people this time drank wine and beer with breakfast, lunch, and dinner, especially in rural parts of New England. It was customary in some parts of New England, actually, for a town bell to ring twice a day to signal a drinking break for workers.
I think we joked on an earlier episode that alcohol then was actually cleaner than water, so that's why it was
that was
widely consumed.
Part of it. I think it was John Adams, but one of the early founding fathers actually said the soldiers in the Continental Army would be better off drinking rum or wine than water. But nonetheless, by the 1800s, rum, whiskey, and other distilled spirits had started to become increasingly available, and they began to replace wine and beer as the daily drink of choice. Now, this was a problem because most people were used to drinking beer and wine all day long, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, which is like 8%. Well, then they started drinking rum and whiskey, specifically whiskey, and it kind of got away from the culture before they could, I guess, see where it was headed, because people started to become, really tolerant on this because of the higher level of alcohol in rum and whiskey. And actually, by the 1830s, the average American over 15 years of age was consuming 88 bottles of whiskey per year.
I mean, that's like a bottle and a half a week.
Yeah, I mean, it's at least a bottle a week. And Americans were actually spending more on alcohol than the total annual expenditures of the U.S. government per year.
That's a lot.
So everybody was boozing. And it was kind of a problem. More and more husbands and fathers, and at this time that was the main, I guess, thoroughfare for society in families. The father was the one who earned the money and represented the family. And when all of these husbands and fathers were spending evenings after work drinking instead of going home, not only were they spending their wages on alcohol, but often they would come home intoxicated, and there was a definite rise in domestic violence and poverty at this time. And a lot of people thought it was solely due to alcoholism.
So was alcohol consumption typically a gender issue? Were there not really women that were drinking? It was all the men? I
mean, I can't say for sure that women didn't drink at all, but like I said, it wasn't a time when women commonly went out on the town by themselves. Like, the men were the ones going out after work and drinking, and women were usually home taking care of the family.
No girls at the saloon?
Not usually.
Ladies'
the saloons
night.
were a pretty rough place. But the other part of it was that there wasn't really, the idea of divorce wasn't common at this time. Like I said, the men were the leaders, quote unquote, for the household. So it was kind of a situation that a lot of women and children got stuck in, where this person that's supposed to represent their family and protect their family ends up being a problem. So these temperance movements started springing up. So everybody kind of viewed, at least on the Prohibition side of things, everybody viewed alcohol as the problem. There were even some towns that sold their jails after Prohibition began because the booze is gone. Nobody's going to break laws now. We're good.
Right, yeah.
So the people in the Prohibition movement were really focused on alcohol as the sole problem. And so this temperance movement begins as a grassroots effort to encourage abstinence from alcohol. Early on, the calls were for the avoidance of distilled spirits only, so those rum, whiskey, but over time became more and more strict, eventually demanding capital T total abstinence, which was everything. And that's where the phrase teetotaler comes from, capital T total. So instead of just calling for, a return to whiskey and beer, they eventually came for everything. So prohibition movements begin to be pushed by groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League, and various Protestant Christian denominations. And that's one of the Ohio connections we have, is the Anti-Saloon League was started here and headquartered in Ohio for a while.
I think we talked a little bit, I don't know if this episode hasn't really come out yet, so people haven't heard it, but we talked on an earlier one about how some of these groups were involved in everyday politics. Like, they were actually influencing the government at the time. Can you explain on anything on that?
they definitely had a lot of ties to especially local governments. And this was all kind of part of the progressive era. And a lot of people don't know this, but Prohibition was also tied to the women's suffrage movement. Because like I said, it was kind of a women's family issue, with men being inebriated every night. So they, in it as part of their fight for representation, for voting rights, they added in Prohibition to improve their circumstance. But states themselves, before there was a national prohibition law, states began to basically decide on their own that they were going to ban alcohol, beginning with Kansas all the way back in 1881, which is about 40 years before the national prohibition. And it's in Kansas in the 1880s that our first woman of Prohibition appears. It's a woman by the name of Carrie Nation, who was a radical Prohibition activist in Kansas, and she became known for attacking taverns in Kansas by scolding their staff and patrons and then destroying all their bottles in their bar with a hatchet.
She was the original Karen.
There you go. She's the original Karen.
Carrie Karen.
So one story actually alleges that Carrie early on went door to door through a Kansas town, eventually destroying 3 separate saloons with bricks, rocks, and this hatchet she had. And she would go in, smash all the bottles, smash the mirror. So eventually, after 3 saloons, she was arrested, but released later that day. And as the story goes, as soon as she was released, she went straight to a 4th saloon with her hatchet in her hand. Her particularly aggressive brand of temperance activism spread around the country, and she actually became pretty infamous among saloon owners who feared that any day she might pay them a visit and smash all their product.
I mean, that's fair. A little worried that someone's going to come in and smash all of your liquor.
So Carrie also argued against tight clothing for women, specifically corsets, and self-described her as a bulldog running along at the feet of Jesus, barking at what he doesn't like.
This kind of, I don't know, in a way reminds me of like the overly aggressive Christians that like, there are definitely things that the Bible talks about being wrong and sacrilegious and stuff. But I mean, even Jesus drank wine. Like there's not really anything in the Bible that explicitly states against alcohol in general, but obviously within reason. But this is just, it seems like to make this your religious mission to destroy alcohol in your town is kind of a stretch. Right.
Well, I actually read during the research for this that there were some Christian temperance unions that actually changed the wording of the Bible that they used. They changed wine into raisin bread just so that there was no booze in the book at all.
It's when Jesus turned the crackers into raisin bread.
Yeah, of course. And this woman, Carrie Nation, for another local connection, also allegedly called Youngstown. Now consider this, she didn't like the booze, she didn't like the saloons, and she called Youngstown the worst city she had ever seen.
I mean, there's people that call Youngstown that now, and that has nothing to do with drinking.
Well, we did, at the time, we had hundreds. I think it was 260 different saloons in the city of Youngstown. There were more saloons than there were grocery stores.
I mean, I feel like we're kind of like that now.
Well, we're
definitely
more
bars and grocery stores now.
But later on, eventually at the federal level, there started to amass some pressure for this proposed amendment for Prohibition. And it was introduced in late 1917, but initially was pretty slow moving. A temporary Wartime Prohibition Act was passed in November of 1918, which was intended to save grain for military use during World War I. But unfortunately, this act didn't take effect until July of 1919, almost a year later, nearly 8 months after the war had ended. And even though it didn't really have a big effect, it still kind of helped pave the way for people mentally for the eventual approval and ratification of the 18th Amendment, which is national prohibition. So later that year, January 16th, 1919, Prohibition began. It was ratified on January 16th of 1919, and 1 year later began. And this amendment initially just prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors within the United States and its territories. And it didn't initially ban, or technically ban, the consumption of alcohol, just the manufacture, sale, and transportation. So
you could drink it, you just couldn't get it.
Right. So the thought is that if you couldn't get it, make it, or sell it, nobody would drink it. And there was this view, especially among prohibitionists, that the saloon owners and alcohol vendors were these pushers. I guess almost like a drug dealer that like we're pushing this on their
Nobody
their
wants
consumers.
to drink. They just keep offering it
They
to
keep
me.
making us do it. And so they thought that removing the pressure of the vendor, people wouldn't partake in the first place. No more jails.
Right.
So one issue with the 18th Amendment was that it didn't clearly define intoxicating liquors, nor did it provide for any regulations for enforcement or punishment for disobeying that law. So a second National Prohibition Act was needed, which was informally known as the Volstead Act, and it was passed after Congress voted to override President Woodrow Wilson's veto. And this act basically remedied those problems. It defined intoxicating liquors as any beverage containing over 0.5% alcohol, and this low threshold even surprised supporters of Prohibition.
That's not really what we describe liquor as today.
Right.
Like liquor is typically like 40% or higher, or at least high proof spirits. You wouldn't think even beer doesn't count as liquor, and beer is still 4 to 12%.
That kind of turned Prohibition into a pretty unpopular thing, especially among immigrants, specifically Catholic Italians and Catholic Irish, for whom the drinking of beer and wine were daily cultural things.
Mm-hmm.
Germans too. I mean, Anheuser-Busch had just arrived, and all of those German immigrants were coming over and starting these massive breweries. But like I said, it wasn't an intoxicating. It wasn't intoxicating liquor, I guess, but it wasn't in that distilled spirits category until this act put it in that category. There's actually a really great story about one of the wineries. I can't remember which winery it is, but instead of producing wine, they transitioned to producing this grape must. It was like just a mixture that you put water into, and it basically would ferment in your tub. And on the package, instead of instructions, they had a warning with the instructions. So like, warning, if you add water.
Put this in a bucket and let it sit for...
Right. So they just hid their instructions as a warning.
Don't want that to turn into something that'll get you drunk.
So this whole thing basically turned the manufacture and sale of alcohol, which was once a legal industry, and pretty much pushed it into the black market, into the hands of criminal gangs who began what was called bootlegging. Now, the name bootlegging stems initially from illegal street vendors of alcohol who sold swigs from bottles hidden in their pant legs, which is super COVID friendly, I heard.
I mean, that makes sense. Bootleg. I've never understood where that comes from.
Yeah, so these guys would have these wide pants and just hide bottles of liquor in a bottle or in a bag in their pants. But legally, the term refers to simply the illegal manufacture, sale, and distribution of alcohol. And this pretty much popped up in any state or local jurisdiction that were considered dry or had prohibition laws. Or sometimes people did it even when it wasn't a dry state, just to avoid paying the taxes on manufactured or imported liquors. So there were some people who basically made moonshine to avoid
even if it was
the
legal.
taxes, right? So while we all kind of associate men like Al Capone or Charles Luciano with the bootlegging business, women were actually far more effective bootleggers than men. Because many states had laws that protected women from being searched, they made better candidates for smuggling. Male bootleggers actually would often hire a woman to ride along with them, I guess, just to kind of give the air of innocence and make them less susceptible to stop and search.
Yeah, the innocent women wouldn't have anything to do with this evil sin of bootlegging.
Of course. An Ohio newspaper actually reported that no self-respecting Prohibition agent would stop a vehicle with a woman in it. Some women would hide liquor on their body or in their clothes and taunt enforcement officers to search them, threatening to sue anyone who touched them. They were harder to detect and therefore arrest, much less likely to boast or be confrontational with officers. At times, even if they admitted to owning a still, authorities just wouldn't believe them and think that there was no way a woman would be capable of running a distillery.
Yeah, come on. What man is doing this for you? Who are you taking the fall for?
Juries were more reluctant to convict them, especially mothers and grandmothers for their crimes because they had children. They usually received shorter sentences, smaller fines, or were simply pardoned. So it just made more sense than if you had an operation and you had
Right.
women available who were willing to do this, it made more sense from a, I guess, stealth perspective. And it's believed that at the time, female bootleggers outnumbered males 5-1.
Wow. That's
So, yeah.
a lot. That's like probably one of the biggest industries to have
Yeah.
women represented as illegal moonshining.
I mean, it's a huge spread. And I guess it just makes sense given all of that. I mean, at the time, all of those, I guess, societal, social things that we don't really think about today as much. But that kind of does a good introduction, I think, for our topic for today, which is women of Prohibition.
Normally on our podcast, we take a quick break right here, but we're just going to
We're
power
not going
through
to.
it. So if you're listening along, feel free to get yourself a drink, enjoy your own legal ability to consume alcohol, and we will start talking about some of the actual women who are involved in moonshining and prohibition. Matt, you like coffee, right?
I love coffee.
Would you ever want to buy me a coffee?
Anytime, Phil. Just say the word.
You know, our dedicated listeners could also buy me a coffee.
Could they buy me a coffee as well?
They could buy you a coffee.
This sounds fantastic.
We set up this service called Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/historiesbside.
And people can buy us a coffee?
Yeah, it's really just a way for people to support the show if they enjoy the show. And if they're listening to the show, we sure hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, otherwise you're just, wasting your time.
At buymeacoffee.com/historiesbside, there's 3 ways that our listeners can interact with the show. Number 1, you can just donate to the show by clicking Buy Them a Coffee.
2, you can join as a member for $10 a month or $100 a year. Being a member gains you some pretty cool perks. You get access to our monthly bonus episode, History's B-Side Battles, access to our future episode queue, a name shout-out on a future episode. We'll also send you a handwritten thank you postcard and sticker set, and more perks will be announced as we continue on.
There's also some different extras that people can get on our Buy Me a Coffee website. Things like choosing the topic for a future episode. If there's a lesser known person in history that you have an interest in, let us know and we'll do an episode all about them. You can also buy sets of custom postcards, sticker sets, and future merchandise that we add on there as well. Or you can draft your own advertisement script and we will promote whatever you want in a segment like this.
The website again is buymeacoffee.com/historiesbside.
Matt,
Yeah.
you owe me a coffee.
Oh. Do I get a coffee too?
You're buying.
All right.
All right, so today we're talking mostly about women in Prohibition. Some of the more notable ones, I honestly, before researching this, I couldn't name a single woman in Prohibition, so it's kind of...
I don't know that I would have been able to.
Yeah, it was kind of cool to read all this. There's not a ton of stories about them because there's really not a lot of history about criminals. Like,
Right.
we try to, I guess, write them out of the history books. So it was cool to come across some of these names, and they all have very unique and different stories, whether they were producing or distributing or just along for the ride. It was fun to get into some of them and really pick one who would be our main topic today. So before we get into our main topic, we're going to talk about some of these women. The first one I almost made today's main topic is a woman by the name of Maggie Bailey. She was known as the Queen of the Mountain Bootleggers in Harlan County, Kentucky. Now, she obviously was involved during Prohibition, so the 1920s through the early 30s.
Yeah.
She started selling moonshine at the age of 17.
Jeez.
But even after Prohibition ended, she continued to sell moonshine out of the back of her house until she was 95 years old.
Dang.
Harlan County, Kentucky was a dry county, so even after Prohibition was repealed, she still
Had a
couldn't
business.
legally sell moonshine at home.
Interesting.
But people in the town wanted to drink, so they would come to her house and she would know who she could sell it to and distribute it. She herself never drank alcohol, and she often said that she refused to sell to children or to drunkards.
Do you know how she told, like, did she have a test to tell if people are drunkards?
I have to think it's a small
Or is it just
town.
like-
Like, you probably
yeah.
know everyone, you know who the drunkards are. But, I mean, if she's doing it illegally, she's still being responsible in how she's
Right.
selling her moonshine. She was arrested on multiple occasions throughout the county for selling moonshine illegally, but the juries in the town refused to convict her. Everyone loved her. Everyone knew what she was doing, and they knew that she was someone you could go to get your alcohol.
Yeah.
So they didn't want to convict her and arrest her because even the people sitting on the juries were buying alcohol
Right.
from her.
Well, it's kind of that. I mean, it's not even a situation unique to this town. I mean, a lot of Congress was buying right after they voted to pass Prohibition. Were buying alcohol. There was actually a man whose name I can't remember, but he was known as the Man in the Green Hat. There's actually a great.
Did he have a name? It was just the man in the green hat.
No, he had a name, but he was known as the Man in the Green Hat because he wore a green hat. But he actually had an office in the Capitol building where he sold booze.
Kind of like
Bootlegged
a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours.
Right.
Give me alcohol and I won't arrest you.
And there were a couple presidents at the time too that still continued to serve alcohol despite having this law in the Constitution. So it makes sense that like some juries in certain towns would be completely unwilling to convict somebody like this.
So Maggie Bailey lived to be 101 years old, and she continued selling alcohol, like I said, until the last couple years.
Because she
of her
never
life.
drank.
Right, yeah. Everyone else in the town died young, but she was good. The next one we're going to talk about is the one by the name of Willie Carter Sharp. She was a 26-year-old when she was moonshining from Franklin County, Virginia. And she's known as the rum running queen because she helped distribute moonshine across the Virginia border into other states. She was very effective. It's believed that she transported more than 220,000 gallons of her homemade moonshine between the years of 1926 and 1931. She, I guess, didn't even really do it for the money. She always just enjoyed the adrenaline rush of distributing the moonshine.
Alcohol.
She said, "It was the excitement that got me, cars scattering, dashing along the streets. And when she was finally arrested and was put on trial, the specters of the trial talked about how they were more intrigued by the diamonds in her teeth than anything else."
She had grills.
Yes, she had grills. I mean, that's just how lucrative the business was.
Yeah.
She made enough money that she had diamonds encrusted in her
Of
teeth.
course. Well, that's the first thing you buy right after the car and the house.
Absolutely. That's
The
how people
diamonds in your
know you got the goods. The next woman is a woman by the name of Mary Wozniak. I don't know if I'm saying that right. That's got to be some kind of...
Sounds good to me. I mean, I'm not Polish, which is what
Polish
I think that
or
is.
something. But she was a 34-year-old mother, Polish immigrant. I guess I
There we
should have known that. She was a 34-year-old mother and Polish immigrant from LaGrange Park, Illinois, which is pretty close to Chicago. Talk about the Al Capone tie-in. She's in that same kind of area. She earned the nickname Moonshine Mary after a particularly strong batch that she made, which caused a man after a night of drinking to pass out, fall into a bog, and die.
That's really brutal.
I mean, moonshine
dark.
was not the moonshine we know today that's clean
Yeah.
and well produced, and some of it was very strong, very toxic, and led to some bad situations. She was actually the first woman convicted in the state of Illinois for selling fatal moonshine.
So I think we've mentioned moonshine a couple different times already. I have kind of a vague idea of what it is, but is this a legally defined term, or is it just slang for any black market illegally produced alcohol?
So nowadays, we do have a definition for moonshine. It's actually just whiskey that isn't aged properly. Whiskey is aged in barrels, which is what gives it the brown caramel color.
Yeah.
But moonshine is not aged. It's made exactly like whiskey. Today, mind you, it's made exactly like whiskey. It's not aged, so it comes out as a clear liquor. It's very strong. It's pretty harsh. But you can add other things to it. There's a lot of flavored moonshines like that.
Okay.
But back in this time, moonshine wasn't clearly defined. It was something
Just
that
a
was
slang
made
term.
by the shine of the moon at night when you could get away with it.
Gotcha.
So it was just any kind of bootleg, illegal alcohol, really anything that people could make and sell and distribute and get drunk off of. Another woman I wanted to talk about was her name was Gertrude Lithgow, but she really was known by the name of Cleo. This is another woman that I wanted to make this episode because it sounded really cool, but I couldn't find her book. I wanted to read her book for this episode, but it just was not available anywhere I tried to look. But she was known as the Bahamian Queen, and she actually might have been the most successful female bootlegger in history. She was a licensed liquor wholesaler in Nassau in the Bahamas, where she imported scotch from the UK and then commissioned her own boats to smuggle it into the US.
Was her business considered legal by the UK and Bahamas? Was it like only illegal once she started bringing it into the US?
I believe so. I mean, the UK never had, nationwide prohibition. They had
Right.
some small pockets that argued for it, or they might have had like local jurisdictions that didn't allow prohibition or didn't allow the sale of alcohol.
Sure.
But the UK never actually had prohibition the way that America did. So it was legal for her to import her scotch or whatever she was getting from the UK to the Bahamas. It was just when she tried to sell it to the Americas
As soon as she brought a boat to
that
Miami,
it became
was
illegal.
over.
Yeah. But because she was able to bring it in legally and she got actually good liquor, like good scotch, the finest quality, it wasn't this bathtub moonshine that was being sold throughout the rest of the
That's
city
true.
or throughout the rest of the country. She actually was very well known, very popular, very successful because people wanted her moonshine or her alcohol. She was a very tough and independent woman. She never married, but she did on many occasions receive love letters and even marriage proposals by mail sent to her in the Bahamas.
Was this because of her moonshining business, or like
I have to
bootlegging
imagine.
business?
I mean, like people just wanted to have the connection for the alcohol.
You're my booze supplier. We need to be together. It's like history's version of sliding into an Instagram direct message.
The 1920s and so the 2020s sliding into the DMs.
Yep.
She was quoted as saying, "I don't need a man to tell me what to do." So she turned down all of these marriage proposals and she was single and ran her business. And it's believed that she was worth around $1 million in that time. So she was successful and made a lot of money doing what she was doing. I also want to talk about a couple of the women prohibition agents. So this was on the other end, the government officials who are arresting these moonshiners and bootleggers. The first one is a woman named Georgia Hopley. She was actually the first woman prohibition agent when she was hired in 1922. She began her career as a female reporter in Columbus, Ohio. She was actually the first female reporter in Columbus, Ohio. And later she was the publicity director for Warren G. Harding's presidential campaign. So she was a very influential, successful woman involved in politics. But as a prohibition agent, she predominantly just worked in public relations. She spoke at churches and schools and conventions and really just talked about prohibition enforcement and the evils of liquor.
It's just like a DARE officer for alcohol.
Pretty much, yeah. Another prohibition agent that I wanted to make sure I talked about, she was a very different style, different approach than Georgia Hopley, is a woman by the name of Daisy Simpson. She was a young woman who began her, I guess in childhood, she was a delinquent. She got arrested a lot. She got in a lot of trouble for different things, but she turned into an undercover liquor agent. She's most famous for having over 100 disguises. She brought all kinds of different outfits and wigs and makeup, and she would change her appearance every day.
That's awesome.
She would just go hang out in these speakeasies that she was able to find and, go sit at a table and wait for someone to come over and serve her liquor and then immediately arrest that person. She was just...
No, that's entrapment.
It really is. Like, she would walk into a bar, sit down at a table or at the bar and wait for the bartender to come over and hand her a drink and be like, "You're under arrest." She also, this is even more diabolical, would sit outside of taverns on the streets and just pretend to be sick and wait for someone to come over and offer her a little bit of whiskey because that's sort of medicinal at the time. There were legal loopholes for whiskey to be medicine.
Yeah.
So she would wait for someone to come by and offer her a sip of whiskey to help her feel better, and then she would immediately arrest them for having the alcohol on them and trying to distribute it. So she was kind of a different approach to Georgia Hopley. She was very on the streets and, really trying to get to people. She sometimes went a little overboard, as you can probably tell. She was really just arresting unimportant bartenders or people that were just passing it out rather than going after the actual moonshiners, distributors, the people that were really flooding the streets with alcohol. So she had to be reined in a little bit, and she wasn't quite as polished or well-known as Georgia Hopley. So I guess we should probably get into our main topic today.
Crazy Nancy.
We introduced our topic as Crazy Nancy. That was long ago, and we didn't really talk about it, so I guess people might not remember that. But Crazy Nancy is the topic. It's not that Crazy Nancy that we heard so much.
You know what?
I was
looking up trivia for the quiz questions at the end of our episode, and I couldn't find anything on Crazy Nancy the Moonshiner. It was just all Nancy Pelosi articles.
The nickname that I have to imagine our former president didn't know he was referencing a moonshiner when he called the Speaker of the House Crazy Nancy. But Crazy Nancy was a moonshiner. She actually was around before Prohibition was even, national law. She was in Warren County, New Jersey in the late 1800s. New Jersey did have legal sale of alcohol at this time, but she was one of those people that was involved in bootlegging because it was her way of getting around paying taxes. She was able to distribute it for a higher profit because she didn't have to register with the state or whatever agencies and then pay taxes on anything that she made and sold. The alcohol that Crazy Nancy produced was called Applejack. It's fairly well known in the New England region. I don't know that we have it too much here in this area, but you can get it if you actually do look for it. Another common name for it was Jersey Lightning, because it was mostly made in New Jersey and because it was so high proof that it left a burning sensation when you drank it.
Oh my God.
A burning sensation in your mouth that went all the way down to your stomach. But Applejack or Jersey Lightning was just a high proof fermented apple cider. So kind of like what we would drink here at Sundog, but a lot
way
stronger.
More alcoholic.
Yeah. New Applejack is really what left that burning sensation. So new being unfermented, unaged. It was just kind of a I guess, fresher alcohol that didn't have time to settle. You could buy Applejack for about $1 to $1.25 a gallon at the time, which in today's dollars is $32 to $40 a gallon, which is about what you'd buy a bottle of liquor.
Yeah.
This is obviously a gallon price, so it's a little bit bigger, but that's about what you'd buy a standard bottle of liquor for today. But once you aged the Applejack, had a more oily texture. It was smoother. It didn't upset the stomach the way certain other liquors do. It didn't quite have that harsh burning sensation. And the price would jump up to $3 a gallon, which is a lot.
Yeah. So you could basically increase your profit margin just by aging all your products first?
You do that with any liquor today still.
Sure.
You age whiskeys better and the price goes way up on it because people don't want fresh scotch that was just made.
Scotch burning your throat from your...
Right. So like we said, it was legal in New Jersey to produce and sell this Applejack. Legal distillers would pay the proper taxes and the licenses to produce it, but there were a lot of moonshiners who made their own version of Applejack to get around paying these taxes, and they made them basically in caves with concealed entrances and ways that they could hide their actual still. I don't see Nicole around. I was going to invite her up here to talk about the production of hard cider so we can kind of get an idea of what we're drinking while we're here at Sundog. It's okay, you don't have to get her. Basically, the process that I've found for hard cider is very similar to if you were to homebrew beer, but instead of using, hops and barley and malt, you take preservative-free apple juice, so fresh, raw apple juice, dissolve it with brown sugar or other types of spices. You steep it while it's boiling and very hot. Eventually, you need to cool it. You add the yeast the same way that you would when you're brewing beer. Allow it to ferment for several weeks, and then you eventually bottle it for consumption. So it's very similar to making beer, but you're using it with apples and making apple cider.
Right.
To make this Applejack, which is this now stronger proof liquor, you had to freeze already fermented apple cider. So you took actual apple cider, and then you would freeze it, and the process of freezing it is called jacking. So that's where the name Applejack comes from. You would freeze it, and then you would remove the ice crystals that form from freezing it, because alcohol doesn't really freeze. Yeah. So once you're removing the ice crystals, you're taking out the water and everything that's basically diluting the apple cider from being super alcoholic liquor to apple cider, removing it, and then you're turning it into this Applejack, this liquor.
Sure.
Oh, Nicole, do you want to come over here and explain how
we were
cider's
wondering
made?
if you would...
Since you know better than we do.
Stupid hat off?
You can take your stupid hat off. Although the people on the Facebook Live might want to see your stupid hat.
All right, I'll wear the stupid hat.
You want me to switch places with her?
Yeah, you just got to duck down low because the camera's pretty low right here.
I'll duck down low.
So we're inviting Nicole on here. She's one of the owners of Sundog Cellars, who's very graciously having us do our live episode here.
And the stupid hat.
She has the stupid hat. So how is apple cider made? You can explain it better than I can.
So we get unpasteurized, with no preservatives, apple cider. And then we have to measure the bricks to see how much sugar is in it to make sure that the yeast will work properly. So once we measure the bricks, we can add sugar or not add sugar. And then it goes through about 15 days of fermentation. And we need it in Ohio to finish at over 7%.
Oh, really?
alcohol.
I didn't know
Yeah,
that.
because if we don't, the FDA has to come in and test all of our stuff for bacterial growth. So I guess 7% is like the magic number.
So that's a safety thing. That's not like if it's under 7%, it's classified as some other kind of alcohol.
Correct. Like I would rather it be lower because I mean 2 ciders and you're like, what day is it? Because it's 8+% over here. But yeah, we have to do that for the FDA. And so after that, it ferments. Sometimes we filter it. We try not to filter it because we feel it takes like all the fun stuff out of it. And then we add whatever fruits we want to use to add the flavors.
I'm drinking the watermelon strawberry one right now.
Yeah, waterberry.
It's actually good. Yeah.
That's the second cider we ever made.
Really?
The first cider we made was the Night Rider, which was just apple.
Cool.
And it's named after John Channel, one of my business partners. He was a truck driver, and his nickname was Night Rider. So, and that's why you could see his face.
Oh, okay.
If you guys ever come in here, you can see his face on the wall, and you can know what I'm talking about, and it'll be great.
So if you're listening in the Northeast Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, or anywhere within driving distance of Columbiana, Ohio, come down, visit Sundog Cellars, and thank them for having us here.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you. This is fun.
Okay. Yeah, I'm glad. Do you need more to drink?
I'm good right now.
You're good?
But
Okay.
once we are done, we'll be
Matt,
having
okay.
more.
Bye, everyone.
All right, we'll let Matt come back on the microphone here.
I don't have a fun hat.
You need a fun hat.
So basically, we take the process of making hard cider and we go through what's called freeze distillation to turn it into Applejack. Basically, freezing the cider, removing the ice crystals, and then as you do that, you're taking what's the opposite of diluting it? You're making it more concentrated
yeah.
to make it a higher proof alcohol. This process is called jacking or freeze distillation. And basically, it would increase the alcohol content of the apple cider from, like Nicole was saying, typically under 10% is cider. It's usually around 8 to 10%. And this process could increase the alcohol content of Applejack from that 8 to 10% to 25 to 40% alcohol by volume, which is what we know more as like standard liquor.
Spirits, yeah.
Yeah, higher proof. The oldest licensed Applejack distillery in the United States is called Laird and Company. It's located in Scobeyville, New Jersey. Like we said, a lot of this comes from New Jersey and the New England states. This Applejack was first produced by a Scottish immigrant by the name of William Laird in 1698, so it's a pretty old spirit. The distillery was actually founded by his great-grandson Robert Laird in 1780. It's noted that George Washington was a big fan of Laird's Applejack.
Interesting.
He even requested the family recipe for his own production, which is kind of cool. I mean, you talk about some of the presidents that were involved in moonshining, I guess, although it wasn't technically illegal at this point. But to have George Washington drinking Applejack. The company survived through Prohibition by producing non-alcoholic apple juice, and they still operate today.
Are they making apple juice today, or did they start making, I guess, distilled spirits?
They make
Applejack.
I don't believe they still make apple juice. They make all kinds of different apple-flavored liquors and liqueurs and brandy and this Applejack. I think they work with a lot of other distilleries to produce vodkas and some other flavored spirits.
Okay.
When I was looking, the
more than
only
just apple juice.
non-alcoholic thing they make is like bar cherries. So like not really apple juice, but they've gone back to the high proof stuff. Most modern Applejack distilleries today have kind of changed the process. They don't do freeze distillation. They use evaporative distillation, which don't ask me how that works because I'm not a distiller, but I assume it's kind of the opposite effect where instead of freezing it, you're boiling it enough that you're kind of getting rid of the...
Yeah, I mean, I don't know a ton about it. I know that most stills, like, you'll boil it and then the vapor at a certain temperature, the alcohol vapor rises and then collects in a cooling tube, and that basically allows you to...
You know way more about this than I do.
It's pretty much the same process for, gin, vodka. I've been to a couple distilleries, and it's usually the same depending on which one you're at. They have different types of stills, but...
All right, so let's get back into our actual topic today.
Crazy Nancy.
We've talked about it a lot, but we haven't really talked about it. So Crazy Nancy, she was, like we said, a bootlegger moonshiner from the late 1880s, which was before Prohibition was actually in effect.
Yeah.
There's not a lot known about a lot of these moonshiners, bootleggers. Literally everything I know about this woman came from one newspaper article that I could find from the 1890s that talked about this story 10 years after it happened. So take that for what you will. It might not be the most factual story that we have on our podcast, but hey, it's a fun one. So in the late 1880s, government officials in Warren County, New Jersey became suspicious of an illegal moonshine business that was operating in the area. And they knew that it was more than just a home brewing type thing where people were making stuff and passing it out to their friends and neighbors. This was a higher scale production distribution network. So suspicion in the town fell on this woman that the townspeople only knew as Crazy Nancy. They didn't even really know her real name, so her name might not have been Nancy. They probably just called her Crazy Nancy.
They just started calling her Crazy
She was
Nancy.
just this really like eccentric woman in the town. They didn't really know who she was, where she came from. They did know that she lived somewhere along the hills of the Pequest River, which kind of runs through Warren County and some of the surrounding areas. But she would appear frequently at town markets throughout eastern Warren County. And in these markets, she would sell berries in the summer. She'd sell furs and other game in the winter. So she was a market person. Like she was there selling stuff that wasn't alcohol. It was legal operation. But she always seemed to have plenty of money, which was not very typical of these market people. And they recognized that she was a shrewd businesswoman. They knew she knew how to strike a hard deal. She was always negotiating with people. It was very opposite of her otherwise eccentric, airy personality.
Yeah.
But the strangest thing about Crazy Nancy was that every winter she would just disappear for 6 weeks.
She's hibernating.
Yeah, she would
Like a bear.
she'd not show up to town anymore. She wouldn't be in the marketplace. She would just be gone for 6 weeks, and then she would just return like normal, like she never left, going back to her usual activities, her usual kind of odd personality, selling in the marketplace.
She was off doing research and development
Right.
for her bootlegging business.
No, they didn't know that was happening yet,
Oh, that's
but she
fair.
was suspected. So because she was suspected, they hired a government detective whose name was Finch. I don't know his first name. They just referred to him as Finch. And he was assigned to keep an eye on Crazy Nancy and her activities. He worked undercover as a farmhand nearby Crazy Nancy's home, which kind of gave him cover for being in the area.
Sure.
She lived in what was basically just a plain building. It was a former barn kind of converted into a house that was built into the side of a hill and pretty isolated from any neighbors or any townspeople in the area.
Yeah.
A few years after she had moved into this house, nearby farmers began to report that young boys had been robbing their apple orchards, sneaking in at night, stealing apples from their orchards, and sneaking back out. So that's why they first kind of reported it to authorities and wanted to get it under surveillance and check it out.
They sure it wasn't just hobbits.
It could have been hobbits.
I feel like hobbits could have been stealing the apples.
Do hobbits eat apples?
I don't know. They eat mushrooms. They stole all kind of stuff in Lord of the Rings. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess that's true. This is the nerdy side of history. Not that we're not already nerdy by doing a history podcast.
I think a history podcast is the least nerdy podcast you could have.
Probably not.
This is actually an NFL draft podcast. It's on
It's
right
on
outside.
behind us. If you're sitting in here listening to us and you're bored, just watch out the window. So Finch first attempted to make acquaintance with Nancy, but he soon found that she had no interest in meeting other people unless to sell them, berries, furs, her usual stuff. She wasn't trying to make friends in the neighborhood. So he had to start spying on her home late at night by hiding in some nearby bushes.
Super creepy.
A little bit, yeah, but he's an undercover agent, so I guess that's what they do. This was also unsuccessful. He was about to give up on this strategy until one night he spotted a man carrying a heavy sack into her home late at night. So Finch automatically assumes that this sack is full of stolen apples that would be used in the illegal Applejack production. He didn't really expect her to have a male accomplice that was helping her steal the apples, so he realized he had to take this situation with more caution. It's the 1800s. A male government agent expects that he could overpower this woman very easily, and he doesn't have to worry about fighting a man to
Now she's
take
got a
him
whole
down.
crew.
Now she has a man working with her. Now he's got to be more cautious before he goes into her home. So Finch monitors her house for a week until one night when he saw her leave home heading into the town of Danville. He arms himself with a revolver, went to her home, picked the lock, and entered. He's walking around the home now, and there's really nothing extraordinary about the house. He notices a few apples that are drying above the fireplace and just some very basic furniture. Not really even living space, really. It's just
Yeah.
kind of some basic furniture, and sees the apples. But then he notices a ladder on the other side of the room that leads up to a lofted area of the home. So he walks over, climbs up the ladder. He's now in the loft, and it's just this pretty much empty room, aside from an old flour barrel that's sitting on one side of it. So he decides this barrel is a good hiding spot. He crouches behind it, realizes he has a good view of the rest of the house, so he kind of hides there for 2 hours waiting for Nancy to return home.
Jeez.
He's very committed
This
to
guy's
this.
real weird. It's in bushes in the loft.
I mean, this is just, policing in the 1800s. versus what we have today, I guess.
I'm picturing like a Pink Panther style, like almost cartoonish
Yeah, I was thinking
situation
about that when I was
here.
reading this. Very goofy. But by the time Nancy returns home, it's nighttime. It's dark outside. She walks in the house. She prepares a meal for dinner and goes about her evening, all while this Finch is spying on her from the loft above. About an hour after she gets home, she locks the door to the house. She lights a candle and carries it up the ladder into the loft. Across this room, Finch is still hidden, but she sets down her candle and begins to remove the floorboards underneath her in the loft area. Once she removes enough floorboards that the hole's large enough, she slips through it and into a narrow hallway that leads down into a section of the hill that had been carved out. And she slips behind a door. So now Finch knows that something's up here.
Yeah.
She's sneaking around to this hidden area of her house. He stays hiding for about another half hour or so, just watching this door, waiting for her to come back out or trying to see what's going to happen. Eventually, the door swings open and a man comes out from behind it. So as the man walks back down the hall, approaches the candlelight that's still in the loft, Finch realizes the closer that this person gets to the candle, that it was actually Nancy wearing men's clothes.
All right.
So it was not a man. It was just the same woman who
was
dressed
her.
as a man.
This is different than the woman with all the disguises, though. That was a
Oh,
Prohibition.
yeah, that's totally
I was
different.
going to say it wasn't one of her disguises, but
So Nancy, now dressed as a man, replaces the floorboards. She goes back down the ladder, grabs an empty sack from a closet, extinguishes the candle, and goes out into the night. Finch now knows what's going on. He realizes that she's out stealing apples, so he's free to leave his hiding spot. He grabs the candle, relights it, and goes to see what's behind underneath the floorboards. So he removes them, he goes down the hallway, he finds this door unlocked, opens it up, and behind the door is a large room that had been dug out of the hill. It contained a still for making applejack, 50 large jugs, and a pile of apples.
So was she literally a one-woman operation? Like she did all of this by herself?
Pretty much. I mean, that's what I'm getting out of it, is that
Jeez.
she collected the apples, she produced the applejack, and then distributed it. At least
Wow.
that's our assumption here. Also in this room is a pile of women's clothes that Nancy was wearing when she came home. Clearly she went into the room, changed into her
yeah.
men's clothes, left those behind, then she snuck out into the night. So now Finch has seen enough. He understands her illegal moonshine operation. It's not a group, it's not a male partner, it's just one person, a woman, who dresses as a man to steal apples that she brings back to her secret still, converts it into large quantities of this illegal applejack, and then she would distribute it or sell it or however. So now Finch has enough to make his arrest. He goes back to the main home. He hides in the kitchen. I think it was just underneath the table. But he's,
Why is he hiding in all of these places?
well, you don't want to spook her.
Well,
He
I
wants to get her
understand that.
back home.
He couldn't just knock on the door?
What do you mean? She's not home yet.
Oh, sorry. I didn't realize she wasn't home. I
Yeah.
thought he was just creeping around her house.
No, he's hanging out in the house waiting for her to come back from stealing apples. So he's sitting in the kitchen, hiding, waiting for Nancy to come back home so he can arrest her. Sometime after midnight, Nancy eventually returns home with a full bag of apples. Clearly,
Naturally.
we knew what she was doing. She lights a candle and turns towards the fireplace to stoke the ashes. As far as she knows, she's the only one in the house. Now Finch approaches from his hiding spot. From up behind her, she has her back to him. He raises his revolver and shouts, "Hold up your hands." Nancy whips around, quickly blows out the candle as Finch fires his weapon and misses her. It's enough time for her to hit him in the face with a stool, knock him unconscious, and before he can react, this door of the home is thrown open and Nancy is gone. She's off out into the
He should have
night.
been cautious with the woman.
Yeah, he thought he was going to be an easy arrest taking on a woman here. So the following day, Nancy's now gone. Never heard from again. The following day, the home is searched by authorities. They found stowed underneath floorboards and hidden in caverns dug out of the hill about 500 gallons of this
Jeez.
applejack.
Just like ready to go.
Yeah,
Not
she fully
like,
produced, just waiting to sell it and distribute it.
wow.
Nancy is now disappeared from Warren County. She was never heard from or seen again, and her real identity is still not known.
We don't know who she is.
It's
Crazy
thought
Nancy.
that she would bring this Applejack to market by burying the jugs in barrels of chestnuts, walnuts, or covering them in animal hides that she brought to sell. And more than likely during those 6 weeks that she would disappear in the winter, she would haul gallons of Applejack to the railroad so that she could ship and sell the moonshine in Philadelphia or New York or other places where they weren't getting.
So she was like
producing this
leaving for
Applejack.
6 weeks to go on a
sell
sales tour.
Right. She made all her money in the winter rather than in the market.
Yeah.
Now, because, like we said, she's pretty obscure, she was never discovered, we really don't know anything about her. All that we know about her is from this one article I found, which was published in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. It was a February 2nd, 1896 article where they talk about this all happened 10 years ago. So we like to think a lot of it's true. It's a fun story.
Yeah.
Who knows?
But
what
there's
was
not a
being
lot of
published back then.
corroboration.
It's really just Finch's account that was retold, probably in police reports or whatever he told his bosses. I'm a little surprised he admitted to getting knocked out in the face by a woman.
That's big of him.
I guess that's one way to get out of failing to make your arrest.
So this whole story came from one newspaper source.
Yeah, and we have a copy of it up here if anyone wants to come look at it when we're done here. Somewhere up here I have a copy of that newspaper article. It's pretty hard to read, so squint your eyes, but it was cool to find it and check out. I remember reading it and I was like, oh, it's a moonshiner about apple cider. This is perfect for doing at Sundog. And I found this article and I'm like reading through and I was like, oh, this is terrible to look at because it's so like old-timey text and really small to read.
Yeah.
And then as I read it, I was like, this is awesome. This is hilarious. She knocked out a cop and got away with it and never was found
Disappeared
again.
into the night like Batman.
So, I mean, it's a cool story. A little bit different than what we typically cover on our podcast, but I thought it would be fun to talk about some of women in Prohibition and also,
Right.
Get the tie into apple cider while we're at
our
Sundog's.
venue. So we usually end our episodes with a short quiz for the host, which today we'll treat Phil as the host. And we usually do this by ourselves in our bedroom, but since we've got people listening, if anybody wants to answer one of the quiz questions themselves, if it stumps Phil,
If you know it, shout it out.
feel free to shout it out. Yeah. So the quiz we usually do basically pertains to the episode topic. As I said, I couldn't find anything beyond Nancy Pelosi when searching for Crazy Nancy, unfortunately. So these are more broad, I guess, Prohibition questions
Good.
than
I
anything
don't know
else.
anything about Nancy Pelosi.
So we've talked about Prohibition now for about an hour, and we mentioned a couple dates, but I don't know that we actually mentioned the official dates of Prohibition. Can you name the beginning and end date?
The beginning was January 17th, 16th or 17th,
17th.
1920,
Yep.
and it ended on December 3rd, 1933.
Fifth.
Fifth.
You were
Darn
super
it, I
close.
was so close.
Yeah, that was good though. I mean,
I
2
just
days
know that
off
we've
isn't
like
bad.
celebrated that as like end of repeal day is what it's called. So
December 3rd
is
or December 5th.
December 5th. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
repeal day, so like that's the day to go out and get a drink because that's the end of Prohibition.
That was good. See,
I was close.
I mean, I feel like that counts as a win.
I'll take it.
This is my favorite of the 3 questions. So Prohibition has had all these ideas for punishments for those who drank during Prohibition. And so I have a multiple choice question for you. I'm going to describe 4 different suggested punishments, and I want you to tell me which one's fake, because I made one of them up.
Okay.
So prohibitionists suggested that in response to drinking, or as a consequence for drinking, one would be A, hung by the tongue from an airplane and flown over the country, exiled to a concentration camp in the Aleutian Islands,
Jeez.
placed in bottle-shaped cages in the public square, or be forced to carry around a full barrel everywhere for an entire month. Which one of those sounds like it's most made up?
Okay, so the last 2 actually sound like on point with like the drinking, the bottle-shaped cage and carrying around a barrel. Were airplanes that big during Prohibition times?
I mean, the Wright brothers were the first decade of the century, so they would have been
but like
13 years old at this point, I think.
guess. What was
10
the
years
second
old.
one?
The second one is exiled to concentration camps in the Aleutian Islands.
That just feels like too real to not be it. All right, so I'm going to say the airplane one is real because airplanes were like popular. Like it was a new thing. They had to be talking about airplanes. The concentration camp is probably too on the nose to like that one has to be real as well. I'm gonna say it's the carrying around a barrel one. Is the big one. Yeah,
nice job. Yeah, I made that up just this morning. The other three were real.
What's the Greek mythology? The guy that's constantly pushing a boulder up a hill.
Not Sisyphus, is it?
I think it is.
Is it Sisyphus?
I hope it is because we're talking about it on our podcast. So hopefully we're right about that. That's a good trivia
History.
question for us. I think it is Sisyphus though.
Yeah, there's some others. I mean, most of them are boring but pretty brutal, like execution and exile.
fair.
One was be forced to drink 2 ounces of castor oil. That was supposed to make the question, but I just didn't.
You know, someone tried that and was like, "Can I get drunk off of this?" during Prohibition, and they were like, "This is terrible. This should be punishment."
What was that? Early this morning, I just found. I forget who it was, but somebody back then actually thought that you could basically run antifreeze through bread and it would filter out the alcohol.
I mean, bread is basically
to make it safe to drink.
Solid beer, right? Or
I
beer is
don't know
liquid
that
bread.
the bread is the important part here. They're dumping antifreeze into it and thinking they
Yeah,
can
but
drink
it's
it.
adding alcohol to bread, so it's eating beer, alcoholic bread.
It's eating antifreeze.
What was that punishment for? Was it for selling?
For drinking.
Or
I mean,
for
it was.
drinking? That's extreme
They
for
weren't actual
drinking.
punishments. They were suggested punishments for those who partook. I just want to know how they were planning to attach the tongue to the plane in a way that would stick.
With a hook.
Dear God. Oh my God, Phil.
Like
Third question.
people get their tongues pierced.
This just turned into some David Blaine
It's like a
episode.
fish.
So for your third and final question, we mentioned at some point dry states, dry counties, and there are actually 10 U.S. states at the current time that allow counties to choose to be completely dry, meaning entirely ban the sale of alcohol. How many of these 10 states can you name?
Jeez. Kentucky is one. Tennessee, I believe. Because isn't where Jack Daniels made dry, I think?
I don't know. You've been to Jack Daniels, yeah? Or no, Jim Beam. Is it dry there? I mean, I assume.
No, Jack Daniels is in Tennessee. It's like Lynchburg or something.
That's not Kentucky.
Shoot. Is it Lynchburg? I don't know. I'm pretty sure where Jack Daniels is made is dry, but I might be wrong about that. All right. Texas?
Yep.
These got to all be mostly southern states, I would think.
9 of the 10 of them you could walk through in one continuous line and
jeez.
not go into another state.
Oklahoma,
Yep.
Kansas.
Yep.
How many is that?
You have 5 left.
Jeez. Alabama,
Yep.
Georgia,
No.
Mississippi.
Yep.
What else is over there? North
Arkansas.
Carolina, Arkansas. I don't know. What did I miss?
Arkansas, Florida, and South
Let me guess the
Dakota.
one that's not. Oh, South Dakota. Okay.
South Dakota.
All right, that was cool.
So they still have, not the entire state is dry, but they still have pockets of,
So 40
Dry
other
counties.
states don't allow local jurisdictions to ban alcohol?
not fully.
That's surprising. I would think that you could have local.
They might, you know what, they might allow it, they don't. There
just don't
aren't-
have
right,
any
there are
dry
no
counties. Okay.
dry counties in the other states.
Fair enough.
There
Well,
are some that are mixed. Like Ohio is mostly mixed in terms of control. I don't know exactly what that means, but it's just not completely dry.
Well, if we ever do a future live episode like this, and it's one of those counties invites us to come do it, we'll tell them no. Just kidding. We'll
We
drink some
only
coffee or
podcast for
tea or
booze.
something. Yeah, that's our payment.
So as usual, and not as usual, since we have a live audience, thank you so much for hanging out and listening. You can find our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and more. You can also follow along on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at History's B-Side.
We'll be around for a little bit. If there is anyone who wants to ask questions or about the show or about today's topic or anything like that, we'll also be monitoring our Facebook page. If anyone who's listening, tuning in on there wants to message us and talk about future episodes or anything like that. We have stickers, bookmarks, postcards, and they're all free up here if you want to grab anything. We also have coffee mugs that are available for purchase. They're $15, or you can just donate to the show at buymeacoffee.com/historiesbside.
Yeah.
Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. Thanks for letting us have our first live podcast.
Thank you, guys. History's B-Side is an independent, listener-supported podcast.
leave us a review or subscribe to the show on your favorite podcasting service. And follow along on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at History's B-Side.
Send us your feedback or inquire about sponsorship and advertising opportunities by emailing us at historiesbside@gmail.com.
You can donate to the show at buymeacoffee.com/historiesbside. While you're there, check out our membership perks, merchandise, and more.
This episode was researched and produced by your hosts, Matt Melito
And Phil Hall. Thanks for listening to History's B-Side.